On the night of July 24th, 1943, German radar operators along the North Sea coast stared at their screens and saw something impossible. Hundreds of aircraft appeared from nowhere, then hundreds more. The displays filled with returns so dense that individual targets became meaningless. Searchlight batteries swung their beams across empty sky, chasing contacts that did not exist. Flak batteries opened fire at coordinates given by radar that had suddenly gone blind. Shells burst harmlessly in dark air. And behind that wall of phantom signals, nearly 800 real bombers flew toward Hamburg. They passed through defenses that should have destroyed them. Most were never tracked. Most were never fired upon accurately. Most returned home. Germany's most sophisticated air defense network had just been made to see things that were not there. What Britain dropped that night was not a bomb. It was not a signal. It was not a machine. It was something so simple, so fragile, and so devastatingly effective that its own creators had been too afraid to use it for over a year. This is the story of how aluminum foil broke the night sky. By the middle of 1942, the air war over Europe had become a war of systems. On one side, RAF Bomber Command launched nightly raids deep into German-held territory, sending hundreds of aircraft into darkness with the hope that enough would find their targets in return. On the other, Germany had built something formidable. It was not a single weapon, it was a network, and it was growing more lethal every month. The foundation of that network was radar. Not one kind, but several, layered together into a system that turned the entire western edge of the Reich into a detection grid. The first version of the line consisted of a series of radar stations with overlapping coverage, layered 3 deep from Denmark to the middle of France, each covering a zone about 32 kilometers long and 20 kilometers wide. Each control center was known as a Himmelbett zone, consisting of a Freya radar with a range of about 100 kilometers, a master searchlight directed by the radar, and a number of manually directed searchlights spread through the cell. The system bore the name of its architect. General Ossif Kammhuber built a defensive network of radar stations and fighter zones, stretching from Denmark to Switzerland. The British called it the Kammhuber Line. It was not a line in any physical sense. It was a corridor of interlocking boxes, each one a self-contained kill zone. The principle was devastatingly simple. A Freya radar would detect incoming bombers at long range and pass their bearing to the controller. 2 shorter-range Würzburg radars would then take over. One was locked onto the night fighter as soon as it entered the cell, and as soon as the Freya picked up a target, the second Würzburg locked onto it. All position reports were sent to the Himmelbett Control Center, allowing controllers to get continual readings of the positions of both planes. Green and red dots projected onto a glass plotting screen, one for the fighter, one for the bomber. The controller simply guided one dot toward the other. When the fighter closed to within 2 miles, its own onboard radar took over. The short-range Liechtenstein Airborne Intercept Radar System was added to the aircraft, allowing them to detect aircraft once the operators had directed them into the area, making searchlights largely redundant. The Liechtenstein set could pick up a bomber in the dark, and from that point, the pilot needed only his eyes and his guns. The night fighters were typically twin-engine machines. Engineers modified planes like the Messerschmitt B, F-110, and Junkers Ju-88 for night use, adding radar and special weapons. A typical crew consisted of a pilot and a radar operator working in close coordination. Training lasted 8 to 12 months compared to just 4 to 6 months for day fighters. That extra time was a reflection of how demanding the work was. These were not men flying into a visible battle. They were hunting in pure darkness, guided by the faint glow of cathode ray tubes and the steady voice of a ground controller speaking vectors through static. Around the major cities, the defenses thickened further. Flak batteries were positioned by the hundreds, their guns aimed by radar-predicted coordinates. Searchlights stood ready, some manually aimed, others slaved to Würzburg sets that could swing the beam directly onto a bomber the moment radar located it. When a bomber was coned by multiple searchlights, the crew inside could see nothing. The interior flooded with white, and the flak followed the light. By early 1943, this system was working. Not perfectly, not always, but well enough to matter, well enough to kill. If this history matters to you, like and subscribe so these stories aren't lost. The losses were not abstract. They were men. 7 to a crew in a Lancaster, sometimes more. A pilot, a navigator, a bomb aimer, a wireless operator, a flight engineer, and 2 gunners. 1 in the mid-upper turret and 1 in the rear. Every aircraft that failed to return carried that weight. Bomber command crews suffered a high casualty rate. 55,573 were killed out of a total of 125,000 aircrew, a 44.4% death rate. A further 8,403 were wounded in action, and 9,838 became prisoners of war. Those numbers accumulated slowly at first, then faster. In 1942, 1,809 Canadians and other RCAF members were killed. In 1943, the number rose to 3,031, and those were just the Canadians. The broader toll across all Commonwealth and British air crews was staggering. The mathematics of survival were grim. A crew was required to complete 30 operations to finish a tour. During the RCAF's Halifax operations between March 1943 and February 1944, the average loss rate was 6.05%, producing a mere 16% survival rate for a tour of 30 operations. That meant for every 100 men who began their tour, only 16 could expect to complete it. The rest would be dead, captured, or wounded, and these were averages. On bad nights, the numbers were worse. The overall loss rate for bomber command operations was 2.2%, but loss rates over Germany were significantly higher. From November 1943 to March 1944, losses averaged 5.1%. The highest loss rate, 11.8%, was incurred on the Nuremberg raid of March 30, 1944. A loss rate of 5% sounds small until you do the arithmetic. At 5% per raid, a crew flying 30 missions had roughly a 1 in 5 chance of completing a tour alive. And those figures excluded aircraft that made it back to England but crashed on landing or limped home with dead crewmen aboard, which accounted for still more casualties that never appeared in the official tallies. Between March 1943 and the early summer of 1944, the life expectancy for bomber crews was very short, with fledgling crews often being lost during their first 12 operations, and even experienced crews being lost right at the end of their tours. There was no front line to retreat behind, no trench to duck into. Every mission was a journey through the same system of radar, searchlights, fighters, and flak. The crew knew that each trip might be the one from which they did not return. They ate breakfast before missions, not knowing whether they would eat dinner. They left personal effects behind in lockers with instructions written on slips of paper. They noted who came back in the morning and who did not. The empty beds in the barracks were the measure of the problem. The missing faces in the mess hall, the new crews that appeared to replace the lost ones, younger each month, often gone themselves within weeks. And the defenses were improving. The Kammhuber Line was being thickened. A massive building program started to add hundreds of Würzburg radars to the system. The boxes were initially sized to the radius of the Würzburg radars, about 22 miles, but the later advent of more powerful radars allowed the boxes to be resized to a width of 100 miles. The line of boxes was eventually several deep, especially around larger cities and in the Ruhr Valley. Every improvement in German radar meant another notch upward in the loss rate. Every new Himmelbett zone added another gauntlet to fly through. The night war had become a grinding calculation. Britain was paying for its bombing campaign in blood, and the bill was rising. There was no question about whether something needed to change. The only question was what, and whether it would come in time. The idea was not born in a flash of inspiration. It arrived the way most wartime innovations do, through painstaking laboratory work carried out by people whose names would never appear in headlines. And its origins lay not in weapons design, but in a quiet understanding of how radar actually worked. Radar's power came from reflection. A radio pulse went out, struck a solid object, and bounced back. The returning signal told the operator that something was there and where. But radar did not care what it was bouncing off. It could not distinguish between a 4-engine bomber and anything else of the right size and electrical conductivity. If something reflected the signal, it appeared on the screen. That was the vulnerability. In the UK, much of the development work was carried out in the early 1940s by Joan Curran, who was the only female scientist at TRE, the Telecommunications Research Establishment. She had been a student at Cambridge University just before the outbreak of the Second World War. Curran had come to the problem through an unusual path. Born Joan Struthers and raised in Swansea on the coast of Wales, she matriculated at the University of Cambridge's Newnham College in 1934. Struthers studied physics on a full scholarship and enjoyed rowing in her spare time. Upon finishing her degree requirements in 1938, she went to the university's preeminent Cavendish laboratory to begin a doctorate in physics. The war interrupted everything. Her doctoral work was abandoned. She and her future husband, Samuel Curran, were reassigned to military research. By 1940, she was at TRE, assigned to the Radar Countermeasures Group. The question that confronted her was a deceptively simple one. Could you create a false radar return? Could you make the screen show something that was not there? Joan devised the technique that was codenamed window. She tried various types of radar reflectors, including wires and sheets, before settling on strips of tin foil, 1 to 2 centimeters wide and 25 centimeters long, that could be scattered from bombers, thus disrupting the enemy's radar. The early experiments were crude. Sam later recalled that Joan carried out personally, very early in 1942, the first experiment on window, and this proved to be an experiment of truly major importance. At home, she cut up a large amount of metal foil with her household scissors and then organized the dropping of the thin metal foil strips from an aircraft sent up from Christchurch Aerodrome. The principle was elegant. Each strip was cut to a length that corresponded to half the wavelength of the target radar. At that length, the strip acted as a resonant dipole. When struck by the radar pulse, it vibrated electrically and re-radiated the energy back toward the receiver. To the radar, a single strip looked like an aircraft. A bundle of strips looked like a formation. A cloud of thousands looked like the sky was filled with bombers. She had arranged that observation. At the radar detection stations on the ground should be done. The effects on the radar screens were truly amazing, and it looked as if a large fleet of aircraft was present. The results stunned the researchers. A handful of metal, cut to the right size, weighed almost nothing, cost almost nothing, and had the capacity to render an entire radar installation useless. The strips drifted slowly through the air, carried by wind, each one returning a signal. Together, they created an impenetrable fog of false echoes that buried the real signals beneath a blizzard of phantom contacts. There was nothing the radar could do. It saw what it was built to see, and what it saw was a lie. The researchers reported their findings up the chain. The implications were immediately understood. If this technique were used operationally, the German night defense system could be blinded. Flak batteries would lose guidance. Searchlights would wander. Night fighters would orbit uselessly, their controllers, unable to distinguish real targets from phantoms. The Kammhuber Line, the entire killing machine that had been built to protect the Reich, would collapse. But that realization carried a second, darker implication, one that would delay the weapon's use for more than a year. The fear was not irrational. It was, in fact, perfectly logical. The technique was too simple. That was the problem. It required no special equipment, no rare materials, no advanced manufacturing. All it needed was thin strips of metal, cut to the right length, dropped from aircraft. Any nation with aluminum foil and scissors could do it. And the moment it was used, the enemy would find the strips on the ground, measure them, understand the principle, and replicate it within days. Although the technique was clearly very effective, it was realized that as soon as it was used, German scientists would find the metal strips, understand how it worked, and use it themselves. Since there was no effective countermeasure, it was judged to be too risky to use, until Churchill eventually authorized its use on 23 July 1943. This was the central fear. Britain had its own radar system. It had defended the island during the Blitz. It was the foundation of the chain home network, the backbone of fighter command. If Germany copied the technique and used it over Britain, the same blinding effect would fall on British radar. Night fighters would be unable to find incoming bombers. Coastal radars would see phantom fleets. The carefully constructed shield that had kept Britain alive through the early years of the war would be punctured. In particular, the British government's leading scientific advisor, Professor Lindemann, balefully pointed out that if the RAF used it against the Germans, the Luftwaffe would quickly copy it and could launch a new blitz. The thought of a renewed bombing campaign against British cities with the defense now blinded by its own weapon, was enough to make senior leaders hesitate. The argument was not about whether the technique worked. Everyone agreed that it worked. The argument was about consequences, about symmetry, about the terrifying simplicity of a weapon that could be turned around in hours. Planners felt that using it was even more dangerous than not, since, as soon as it was used, the enemy could easily duplicate it and use it against them. There was also a deeper, more uncomfortable dimension. The people who most urgently needed the weapon were the bomber crews flying every night into German defenses. The people who most feared its consequences were the leaders responsible for defending British cities. These were different calculations, different risks borne by different people. The bomber crews were dying now. The threat to British cities was hypothetical, but the hypothetical threat was considered more strategically dangerous. And so, the decision was made, again and again, at committee after committee, to delay, to wait, to study, to let the technique remain in the laboratory while the men who could have been saved by it continued to climb into aircraft and fly into the waiting system of radar, searchlights, and guns. The weapon had a name now. It was called Window, and it sat in a classified file, unused, while the war went on. The months passed, the raids continued, and the losses continued with them. Every night that Window remained unused was a night when German radar worked as designed. Every functioning Würzburg set meant another fighter guided to within 2 miles of a bomber. Every successful interception meant 7 men dead, or burning, or falling through the dark. And every empty dispersal point on a British airfield the next morning was a reminder that the tool existed and was not being used. The people who knew about Window were few. The scientists at TRE knew. Senior intelligence officers knew. Churchill's scientific advisors knew. The commanders of Bomber Command knew. But the bomber crews themselves knew nothing. They flew into the same defenses night after night, without any awareness that a countermeasure had been developed, tested, proven, and deliberately withheld. Night fighter engagements under the Kammhuber Line framework contributed to loss rates exceeding 4 to 5% per major raid in early 1943, levels deemed unsustainable for prolonged campaigns, as RAF analyses indicated 5% monthly losses halved force effectiveness within 3 months. The mathematics were existential. At those rates, Bomber Command could not sustain itself indefinitely. New crews were being trained, new aircraft produced, but the pipeline had limits, and Germany was expanding its defenses faster than Britain could absorb the cost of penetrating them. The debate over Window dragged on through the spring of 1943, while Bomber Command fought the Battle of the Ruhr. From March to July 1943, the RAF concentrated on more specific targets in the Battle of the Ruhr, bombing the armaments-related industries in the Ruhr Basin. The Ruhr was nicknamed Happy Valley by the crews, and the name was pure gallows humor. The Ruhr was one of the most heavily defended areas on Earth. Flak was thick, fighters were plentiful, the searchlights lit up the clouds for miles. Crews who flew to Essen, or Dortmund or Duisburg knew the odds. They knew what the defenses could do. They did not know that someone, in a laboratory in Malvern, had once cut aluminum foil with household scissors and made those defenses meaningless. The irony was not lost on the scientists. For over a year, the curious situation arose where both sides of the conflict knew how to use chaff to jam the other side's radar, but refrained from doing so, fearing that if they did, the other side would learn the trick and use it against themselves. It was a stalemate born not of ignorance, but of mutual knowledge, each side sitting on the same secret, each side afraid to move first. And while the chess game played out in committee rooms and classified memoranda, the bomber crews who could not see the board kept dying on it. The silence around Window had become its own kind of weapon, aimed not at the enemy, but at the men it was built to protect. By the summer of 1943, the calculation changed. Several factors converged. The threat of a renewed German bomber offensive against Britain was receding. The Luftwaffe was being drawn into other theaters, bleeding strength on the Eastern Front and in the Mediterranean. Its bomber fleet was not what it had been during the Blitz. And critically, Britain's defensive radar was improving. New centimetric radar sets, operating on wavelengths much shorter than the frequencies Window was designed to jam, were beginning to enter service with fighter command. At this time, it was felt the new generation of centimetric radars available to fighter command would deal with any Luftwaffe response to RAF bomber command use. This was the strategic shift that tipped the balance. If British defenses could now operate on frequencies that Window could not jam, then the fear of German retaliation became less acute. The weapon that had been considered too dangerous to use could now be deployed with a measure of insurance. Arthur Harris, Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, had long wanted to use it. The intelligence community had pushed for it. The scientists had argued for it. Now, at last, the political and strategic conditions aligned. Churchill authorized the use of Window on July 23, 1943. The target had already been selected. Hamburg was Germany's second-largest city, was Europe's largest port, and had important dock works which had built the mighty battleship Bismarck amongst many other ships. There were 2 large and active U-boat yards and aircraft factories. The operation was given a name from the Old Testament. It was called Gomorrah. Operation Gomorrah was a sustained area bombing campaign of the German port of Hamburg in 4 night attacks by the Royal Air Force and 2 daytime attacks by the United States Air Force in July and August 1943. It would be the heaviest aerial assault in history to that point, and it would be the first time that the weapon Britain had been hiding for more than a year would be unleashed. The briefing rooms across eastern England filled on the afternoon of July 24th. Hundreds of crews were told their target was Hamburg, but that was routine. What was not routine was the next item. The intelligence officers explained that tonight, for the first time, the bombers would carry bundles of thin metal strips. They were told how to dispense them. They were told what they would do. And they were told, without elaboration, that the German radar system would not function normally. The crews listened. Some were skeptical. Others were simply tired. They had been flying into radar-guided defenses for months. They had watched friends die. And now someone was telling them that strips of paper and foil would change everything. They would find out that night whether it was true. The weapon itself was almost absurdly simple. An early form of Chaff, Window was a low-tech product of aluminum strips 10.5 inches long and 3/4 of an inch wide, attached to one side of the coarse black paper. That was it. Strips of metallized paper, each one thinner than a pencil, each one lighter than a feather, each one to a radar operating on the right frequency, indistinguishable from a heavy bomber. The length was the key. Chaff is the name given to the radar countermeasure in which a cloud of metal strips is deployed, each of length approximately half the wavelength of the victim radar, so that each behaves as a dipole. The German Würzburg radar operated at a wavelength of approximately 53 centimeters. A strip cut to half that length, about 25 to 27 centimeters, resonated perfectly. When the Würzburg pulse struck the strip, the metal vibrated at the radar's own frequency and bounced the signal back as if it were a solid aircraft. Single strip produced one return. A bundle of 2,000 strips, released from an aircraft, produced 2,000 returns. Multiply that by hundreds of bombers, each dispensing bundles at regular intervals, and the radar screen became an indecipherable blizzard of light. They were packed into brown paper bags containing 2,200 strips and dispensed by hand out a hatch in the bomber's fuselage at the rate of a bag a minute. The dispensing was primitive. There was no mechanical ejector, no automated system. A crew member, usually the bomb aimer or the navigator, sat near a flare chute and pushed bundles out at timed intervals. The strips spilled into the slipstream, separated instantly, and began their slow descent. They tumbled and twisted, catching air, spreading into a vast drifting cloud. Each cloud persisted for minutes, descending slowly, each strip reflecting radar energy the entire way down. The visual effect from inside the aircraft was strange and beautiful. A silver rain of tiny rectangles, glittering faintly in the moonlight, falling away into the dark below. From the cockpit, it looked like nothing. From the radar screen below, it looked like the sky was full of bombers. The weight of each bundle was about 1 pound. The cost was negligible. The aluminum was the cheapest material in the supply chain. The cutting was done by hand, by workers who did not need specialized training. The packaging was brown paper. The delivery system was gravity. There was no guidance, no electronics, no moving parts. The weapon was entirely passive. It did not jam the radar by overpowering its signal. It did not destroy the radar by attacking it. It simply fed the radar exactly what it expected to see, in overwhelming quantity, so that the truth was buried under a flood of convincing lies. That was its genius. Window did not break the radar. It made the radar work perfectly. It just gave it too much to work with. Flying conditions were perfect on July 24th, as 791 RAF heavy bombers lifted off for Hamburg. The bomber stream formed over England in the fading light and turned east across the North Sea. Lancasters, Halifaxes, Stirlings, and a handful of Wellingtons, each loaded with high explosive and incendiary bombs, and now, for the first time, bundles of metallized paper strips. The crews began dispensing Window as they approached the German coast. One bundle per minute, pushed through the flare chute, swallowed by the slipstream. The strips scattered instantly, spreading into a broad, drifting cloud that expanded as it fell. Behind each aircraft, a trail of phantom signals formed. On the ground, the first indications were subtle. The Freya early warning radars along the coast detected the incoming stream as expected. But as the aircraft came within range of the Würzburg sets, something began to happen that the operators had never seen before. The screens, normally showing clean returns from individual aircraft, began to fill. Not with the crisp dots that controllers were trained to read, but with a spreading, shifting mass of returns that blurred the display from edge to edge. It looked like the entire sky was full of aircraft. Hundreds, thousands. More aircraft than existed in the entire Royal Air Force. The clouds of shredded tinfoil dropped by the Pathfinders, as well as the initial bomber stream, produced millions of false echoes, which saturated the German radar screens and made it impossible for controllers to supervise the anti-aircraft artillery and night fighter defenses effectively. The Himmelbett controllers tried to isolate individual targets. They could not. The plots on the Seeberg table, normally showing a single red dot for a bomber and a green dot for a fighter, were buried under a wash of meaningless signal. Every strip of foil was a dot. Every dot moved. Every movement suggested direction, speed, altitude. The system that had been designed to track one aircraft at a time was now being asked to track millions of phantom contacts. The controllers radioed their fighters with positions that shifted every second, headings that contradicted each other, altitudes that made no sense. The fighters climbed to intercept and found empty air. They turned to new coordinates and found more empty air. The radar operators on the ground watched their screens with something close to disbelief. The radar-guided master searchlights wandered aimlessly across the sky. The anti-aircraft guns fired randomly or not at all, and the night fighters, their radar displays swamped with false echoes, utterly failed to find the bomber stream. The Liechtenstein radar in the night fighters was affected just as badly. Pilots who relied on their onboard sets to find targets in the final miles saw screens full of returns in every direction. There was no way to isolate the real bomber from the cloud of phantoms surrounding it. The system that had been steadily refined over years to guide a fighter to within visual range of its target had been overwhelmed in a single night by strips of paper and aluminum. The entire German defense framework, from early warning to final interception, was consumed by ghosts. The searchlight batteries were the most visible symptom of the collapse. In normal operations, radar-directed searchlights could fix a bomber almost instantly. The Würzburg set locked onto the return, calculated the bearing and elevation, and slaved the searchlight directly to the target. The beam swung into position with mechanical precision, catching the aircraft in a cone of blinding white. Once illuminated, the bomber was visible to every flak battery and fighter within miles. It was one of the most feared experiences a bomber crew could face. That night over Hamburg, the searchlights had nothing to lock onto. The Würzburg sets that directed them were receiving thousands of returns simultaneously. The beams swung erratically, tracking false echoes, snapping from one phantom to another, sweeping long arcs across empty sky. To the bomber crews above, the difference was immediately apparent. The beams that usually locked on with terrifying accuracy were wandering aimlessly, crossing and uncrossing, searching for aircraft that were not there. Flak was similarly degraded. The heavy 88mm guns around Hamburg depended on radar-predicted firing solutions. Without accurate tracking data, the batteries had two choices. They could fire on preset barrages, filling a box of sky with shell bursts, regardless of whether aircraft were in it. Or they could simply not fire at all. Most did some version of both. The sky over Hamburg flashed and rumbled with explosions, but the bursts were scattered, poorly aimed, more a matter of probability than precision. Shells that would normally have been fused to detonate within lethal radius of a tracked aircraft now burst at random altitudes, in random directions, a vast expenditure of ammunition for almost no tactical effect. The bomber crews noticed immediately. Crews who had flown to the Ruhr, who had been coned by searchlights and rocked by flak, who had watched aircraft beside them catch fire and spiral. Down now flew through a sky that was strangely, almost eerily, quiet. The flake was there, but it was unfocused. The searchlights were there, but they were blind. The fighters were there, but they could not find the bombers. Britain lost only 12 aircraft in this raid, out of 791 that flew, thanks to the new radar jamming device called Window. 12 aircraft lost out of nearly 800, a loss rate of roughly 1.5%. Previous raids of comparable size against heavily defended targets had typically cost 4 to 5%, sometimes more. Window had cut the losses by more than half. The Pathfinder aircraft marked Hamburg accurately. The main force bombed effectively. As a result of the clear weather and the navigation accuracy provided by the H-2S, the Pathfinders performed very well, and their markers fell very close to the designated aiming point. About 1,500 people were killed in that first raid, and significant damage was done to the city's infrastructure. But from the perspective of Bomber Command, the transformative fact was not the damage inflicted. It was the survival rate. For the crews who returned, the mission felt different from anything they had experienced. They had flown deep into one of the most heavily defended targets in Germany and come back with losses that would have been considered light on a raid to occupied France. Something fundamental had shifted. The crews knew something had worked. They could feel it in the silence where the searchlights should have been. They could feel it in the absence of the usual stomach-clenching flak that followed a lock-on. They could feel it in the simple, unlikely fact that they were still alive. On previous raids to heavily defended targets, the bomber stream was a gauntlet. Aircraft were tracked from the moment they crossed the coast. Fighters appeared from below or behind, guided to within visual range by ground controllers who could read the bomber's course and altitude from their screens. Flak concentrated where the bombers were densest. Searchlights found individual aircraft and held them for the guns. The whole system worked together, and crews who entered it knew that survival was a matter of probability, not skill. That night, the probability had changed. For over a week, Allied attacks devastated a vast area of Hamburg, resulting in more than 40,000 civilian deaths, with the loss of only 12 out of the 791 bombers on the first night. The subsequent raids in the Gomorrah series continued to use Window, and the German defenses continued to struggle, although the percentage of British bombers lost increased with each raid, as the Germans became more adept at distinguishing between window diversions and actual bombers. Operation Gomorrah proved devastating to Hamburg and to German morale. The crews responded to the new reality in a way that was entirely human. Seeing this as a development that made it safer to go on operations, many crews got in as many trips as they could before the Germans found a countermeasure. There was a sense, shared but unspoken, that this advantage was temporary, that the window of opportunity, like its namesake, would close, and it would close. But for now, the crews who had been dying at unsustainable rates were being given something they had not had in months. Time. Crews that might have been lost. Over Hamburg were completing their tours. Crews that would have been destroyed before their 10th operation were reaching their 15th, their 20th. The cumulative effect was not just numerical, it was psychological. For the first time in the night war, the bomber crews had the sense that the balance had tilted, even if only slightly in their favor. The crews did not know the full story. They did not know that the weapon had been ready for over a year. They did not know about the debates, the delays, the committees, the classified memoranda arguing about hypothetical German retaliation. They knew only that someone had given them bundles of aluminum strips and that the defenses had gone blind. For now, that was enough. On the German side, the first night of Window produced something close to panic. The radar operators knew their equipment. They had been trained on it, had used it every night, had built their professional identities around the ability to read a Würzburg screen and extract a target from the clutter. On the night of July 24th, the screens told them nothing useful. the entire display was awash of signal. Controllers who were accustomed to precise, methodical interceptions found themselves issuing contradictory orders and then falling silent because there was nothing coherent to say. The week-long Battle of Hamburg proved disastrous for the Luftwaffe when the first use of window by Bomber Command knocked out the Himmelbett radar defense system. Window jammed the GCI system, airborne radar sets, gun-laying radar, and searchlight controls, and British losses to flak and night fighters declined. The night fighter pilots were equally baffled. Their Liechtenstein radar sets, already limited in range, were swamped by the same false echoes that overwhelmed the ground stations. Pilots reported radar screens showing contacts in every quadrant. Every time they turned to pursue one, it dissolved into a cluster of others. The pilots were reduced to searching visually, scanning the dark for exhaust flames or the faint silhouette of a bomber against the stars. Most found nothing. The morning after the first raid, German engineers began examining the evidence. Strips of metallized paper had been collected from the ground around Hamburg. They were measured. Their dimensions were noted. The frequency of the Würzburg radar was well known. The relationship between the strip length and the radar wavelength was immediately apparent. Although the metal strips puzzled the German civilians at first, German scientists knew exactly what they were, duple, but had refrained from using it for the same reasons as Lindemann had pointed out to the British. This was the most remarkable aspect of the entire episode. Germany had developed the same technique independently. It transpired that German scientists had independently had similar ideas. The technique was known as duple, after a region in Berlin where the tests were made. The Germans had run their own experiments, understood the principle, and reached the same conclusion as the British. They too had been afraid to use it for the same reasons. For very similar reasons, Göring, chief of the Luftwaffe, kept the results in strict secrecy and prohibited its use. Both sides had been sitting on the same weapon. Both had feared the other would learn the secret, and all along, both had already known. The symmetry was unsettling. It meant that the year of delay on the British side, the year during which bomber crews died while the weapon gathered dust, had been mirrored by an identical delay on the German side. Both air forces had chosen to accept losses rather than risk the consequences of a technique they could not counter. Now the secret was out. The question was how quickly Germany could adapt. 6 weeks after the Hamburg raid, the Luftwaffe used duple in 80 centimeter by 1.9 centimeter lengths during a raid on the night of October 7th and 8th, 1943. The speed of the response confirmed what both sides had feared. The technique was trivially easy to replicate. Germany had already done the research. The strips were already designed. They simply needed permission to use them, and after Hamburg, that permission came. In raids in 1943 and the mini-blitz of Operation Steinbock between February and May 1944, duple allowed German bombers again to attempt operations over London. But timing matters in war. Germany's deployment of duple came at a point when its offensive bomber capability had been drastically diminished. The Luftwaffe of 1943 was not the Luftwaffe of 1940. The great fleets that had devastated London during the Blitz no longer existed. Resources had been consumed on the Eastern Front, in North Africa, in the Mediterranean. The bomber units that remained were a fraction of what they had been. Although theoretically effective, the small number of bombers, notably in relation to the large RAF night fighter force, doomed the effort from the start. The British fighters were able to go aloft in large numbers and often found the German bombers in spite of duple. This was the critical asymmetry. When Britain used window, it was used by a massive force, nearly 800 bombers releasing millions of strips simultaneously, overwhelming an entire radar network across hundreds of miles. When Germany used duple, it was used by far fewer aircraft, dropping far less material, against a British defense system that was numerically stronger and increasingly equipped with centimetric radars that the strips could not jam. Ironically, these raids hurt Germany more than Britain. The Luftwaffe lost many irreplaceable air crew and modern aircraft. This weakened their ability to fight back when the D-Day invasion began. Germany had the knowledge, but not the capacity to use it at the scale that mattered. The window of opportunity, and the term felt cruelly precise, had already passed. Britain's gamble had paid off. The year of delay, for all its cost, had placed the first use of the technique at a moment when it could do maximum damage to German defenses while minimizing the consequences of German replication. The weapon that both sides had feared to unleash had been worth the wait, but only just, and only from the perspective of strategists who measured success in percentages and force ratios, not in the faces of men who had been lost during the waiting. After Hamburg, the night air war over Europe was never the same. The Kammhuber Line, the system that had given German night defenses their coherence and their killing power, was functionally broken. The measures accelerated the abandonment of the Kammhuber Himmelbett system and paved the way for a more flexible approach. The precise box-by-box method of tracking and intercepting individual bombers through dedicated Himmelbett zones could not survive in a sky filled with window. The entire architecture of ground-controlled interception, which depended on radar being able to tell a bomber from empty air, had been undermined. The Germans adapted. They had no choice. New tactics were developed with remarkable speed. Wilde Sau, or wild boar, was the term given by the Luftwaffe to the tactic used from 1943 to 1944, in which British night bombers were engaged by single-seat day fighter aircraft. It was adopted when the Allies had the advantage over German radar-controlled interception. The fighters had to engage the British bombers freely as they were illuminated by searchlight batteries, while avoiding their own anti-aircraft fire. This was an extraordinary regression. The Luftwaffe, which had spent years building a sophisticated radar-guided night defense system, was now sending single-engine day fighters into the dark to hunt bombers by sight. Pilots looked for silhouettes against searchlight beams, against the glow of burning cities, against the faint backlight of cloud layers illuminated from below. The Zahme Sau, or tame boar, tactic ran parallel. Twin-engine night fighters were released from their boxes and directed into the general area of the bomber stream, where they hunted independently using whatever instrument still functioned. An integral part of Zahme Sau was to use the RAF's own window to confirm the position and track of the bomber stream. The fighters tracked the clouds of chaff and flew toward them, reasoning that the source of the window must be the bombers themselves. It was a crude but partially effective adaptation. The tactic provided a stopgap, and more Allied bombers were shot down, but German losses also rose. The Luftwaffe was not able to replace losses, and due to a high attrition rate, fighter readiness dwindled. The new tactics were costly for both sides. Wild Sau pilots operated without radar, without ground guidance, and often without adequate night flying training. They flew into their own flak. They crashed on landing. They collided with other aircraft in the dark. With the onset of poorer weather in the autumn of 1943, wastage through accidents and icing soared, and German pilots could not implement Wild Sau as effectively as before. Meanwhile, Germany raced to develop new radar systems that could operate on frequencies window was not designed to jam. Research was intensified for more effective radar technology. The Liechtenstein SN2, operating in a lower frequency band, entered service and proved initially resistant to the standard window strips, but the British responded with their own countermeasures, and the technological cat-and-mouse game continued to accelerate. The fundamental change was not tactical, but epistemological. After Hamburg, radar could no longer be trusted as absolute truth. Every signal had to be questioned. Every contact had to be verified. The certainty that had made the Kammhuber Line so lethal had been replaced by doubt, and doubt was a far less efficient killer than precision. Window left no wreckage. It produced no craters. It created no dramatic footage. The bombs that fell on Hamburg created images that seared themselves into memory. The firestorms, the flattened neighborhoods, the refugee columns. But window itself was invisible in its effects. It did not destroy anything. It simply confused. And confusion, however powerful, does not photograph well. This is why the story has been largely forgotten. The dramatic arc of the bombing war is told through fire and rubble, through the tonnage of bombs dropped and the cities reduced to ash, through the faces of survivors and the testimony of the dead. Window does not fit into that narrative. It is a story of information, not destruction. A story of denial and deception, not kinetic force. No museum displays a strip of window and draws crowds. No documentary lingers on the moment a radar operator's screen turned white. The visual language of war does not have a vocabulary for what happened in those control rooms. The terror was abstract. The collapse was invisible. The victory was measured not in what was destroyed, but in what was not. 12 bombers lost instead of 40. A percentage point instead of a firestorm. A statistical shift that translated into hundreds of men who came home and never knew precisely why. Joan Curran, the woman who had devised the technique, received no public recognition during the war. In her obituary, R.V. Jones was quoted as having said, "In my opinion, Joan Curran made an even greater contribution to victory in 1945 than Sam." Like many other female scientists who have faded unrecognized into history, Curran and her work was discussed only by men, and only in the context of that of her male counterparts. Her voice was never recorded. Her perspective on the weapon she created was never published. She went on to work on the Manhattan Project, raised her children, and spent her later years advocating for the disabled. She died in 1999, and the weapon she, built from household scissors and aluminum foil, remained one of the most effective deceptions of the entire war. History remembers what explodes. It forgets what deceives. And yet deception, in the right circumstances, saved more lives than any bomb. There is a tendency when telling the history of warfare to privilege the weapons that destroy, the bombs that flatten cities, the guns that pierce armor, the missiles that track heat. These are the instruments of force, and force is the language in which wars are most commonly narrated. But Window belonged to a different category. It was not a weapon of destruction. It was a weapon of denial. It did not kill the radar operators. It did not blow up the Würzburg sets. It did not damage a single gun or searchlight. It simply made them useless. It interposed a layer of false information between the defense and the attacker, and in doing so, it neutralized an entire system without touching any of its components. The implications were profound. A single strip of aluminum, cut to the right length, had the same radar signature as a Lancaster bomber, weighing 30 tons and carrying a crew of 7. The investment required to create that false signature was negligible. The investment required to build the radar system it defeated was enormous. The asymmetry was total. Window cost virtually nothing. The Kammhuber Line had cost millions of marks, thousands of man-hours, and years of engineering. This was the deeper lesson. In the war of information, cost and scale did not correlate the way they did in the war of material. A matchstick could defeat a bank vault if the vault's lock was made to recognize the matchstick as a key. Window did not overpower the German defense. It spoke the defense's own language back to it, fluently in overwhelming volume, and the defense could not tell the difference. There is also a human dimension that resists easy analysis. The decision to delay Window's deployment was a decision to accept losses. The men who made that decision were not callous. They believed they were protecting a larger strategic interest. They weighed the lives of bomber crews against the potential vulnerability of British cities and concluded that the risk of retaliation outweighed the cost of continued losses. That calculation may have been correct. It may also have been made easier by the fact that the people bearing the cost were young men in aircraft, not the officials sitting in committee rooms. This is not a judgment. It is an observation. War forces choices that peacetime finds intolerable, and the choice to withhold Window was one of them. It sits in the record, unresolved, alongside the names of the men who died during the waiting. What Window ultimately proved was that the most powerful weapon in a radar war was not a bigger radar. It was not a stronger signal. It was the ability to make the enemy's own system lie to him, to turn his instruments into sources of confusion rather than clarity, to use his strength against him. The German defense was not destroyed at Hamburg. It was deceived. And deception, once introduced, could never be fully undone. The war shifted the moment radar could no longer be trusted. Before Window, radar was certainty. It was the instrument that turned night into day for the defender. It revealed what the eye could not see. It gave coordinates, headings, altitudes, speeds. It transformed chaos into data and data into lethality. The Kammhuber Line worked because every officer in the chain, from the Freya operator to the night fighter pilot, could trust what the radar told them. Trust was the invisible infrastructure that held the entire system together. Window broke that trust. After July 1943, every signal on a German radar screen was suspect. Every contact might be real. Every contact might be foil. The operator could not know which until it was too late. And in a system that depended on speed, on rapid identification and rapid response, that uncertainty was fatal, not to the operators themselves, but to the system they served. Britain did not destroy the German night defense. It did something more, subtle and more lasting. It made the defense doubt itself. It introduced ambiguity into a process that depended on precision. And ambiguity, once planted, could not be uprooted. Every adaptation the Germans made, from wild sow to zame sow to new radar frequencies, was an attempt to restore the certainty that window had taken away. Some worked partially. None restored it fully. The principle endures. Window dispensers are still fitted to all modern military aircraft. They use cartridges of aluminum-coated fiberglass deployed by a small explosive charge, which produces a fast-blooming cloud. The technology has been refined, miniaturized, automated, but the core idea is the same. Feed the radar what it expects to see. Drown the truth in plausible falsehood. Make the instrument see ghosts. Joan Curran stood at the beginning of that principle. She cut aluminum foil in her kitchen and changed the air war. She did not build a machine. She did not invent a device. She discovered a vulnerability in the idea of mechanical certainty and exploited it with the simplest materials available. The weapon she created did not kill. It confused. It did not destroy systems. It made them unreliable. It did not overpower the enemy. It made the enemy overpower himself, chasing phantoms of his own creation, firing at nothing, defending against air. There is something profoundly unsettling about a weapon that works by making you see what is not there. It suggests that the line between knowledge and ignorance is thinner than we like to believe, that the instruments we build to see the world more clearly can be made to deceive us, that certainty itself can be weaponized. On the night of July 24th, 1943, nearly 800 bombers flew into the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. They carried bombs, and they carried bundles of paper and aluminum. The bombs fell on Hamburg and burned it. The strips of foil fell into the sky and blinded it. The burning was remembered. The blinding was forgotten. But it was the blinding that changed the war.